Anyone?
Right, good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate this is the post-lunch nap time. So we have two options. We can either work through this or we can all have a sleep in the corner. I won't put it to a vote. I think it could possibly go the wrong way at this point. So welcome. Thank you for coming along. Thank you for inviting me to come here and talk a little bit at the workshop today.
Sorry.
And Carlos is sorry.
Yes,
Okay. I thought there was something more to that than there was. Okay. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to come along, and this should be fun, hopefully. So I know quite a lot of you. We've got a few people that have been coming to the regular kind of training schools that are being organised by Cost. And there are quite a few people, probably in even numbers, that I haven't met before. So if you don't know me, hi, I'm Chris. Chris Hughes. I'm currently Director of Computer Science and Engineering at Salford University. Might sound very grand. I've just been massively over-promoted beyond my capabilities, and it's very exciting. But that's a story for possibly over dinner and all those kind of things. So here we're going to have a bit of a workshop. And again, it's a fantastic position to be in because Carlos wrote this title for me, and I guess I need to try and honor what the title said. To me, it's actually a really good thing because in previous workshops, I guess we've kind of progressed slightly forwards, but there's been a bit of repetition. And so what I'm very keen to do today is that we kind of focus on moving forwards, looking at some new things, talking about new ideas. And there's a key word in the title as well, presence, which is one that I hadn't really considered before I was preparing for the workshop today. So we're going to be together for about the next hour, I guess. And when you take apart the title that we've put on this workshop, there are three main components that are important to me. Obviously, the cost action, everything we do, it's very focused on accessibility. But there are two other terms within the title that I find particularly interesting. And that's first, the presence. I didn't actually know what presence was until I started researching this workshop. I just kind of assumed you put on a head-mounted display, you're in a virtual environment, you just kind of believe where you are. And when you start reading into it, actually, most of the tech industry don't know the difference between things like immersion and presence and those kind of things. So hopefully, although I've got my opinion, it doesn't appear that the community as a whole actually has a correct answer to this. But maybe we can have some discussion around that later. And also everything that my work is focused on the kind of XR and the XR environments that sits alongside it. And as I come from a technology background, I'm not a user tester. I don't know anything about accessibility really, other than what I've learned. I like to build prototypes. And so I warn you as well, this workshop is kind of going to be run from the perspective of prototyping, rapid prototyping. Let's build stuff, see what happens. Let's not write things on the wall and ask people questions about it. Let's try and build something to put in front of someone. And that's kind of the ethos of a lot of what sits behind this. Right, so we're going to be together for about an hour now. This is what I hope to cover. I'm going to give you a bit of background. So for those of you that know me, this first 10 minutes might be the repetitive bit where I kind of tell you what my motivation is, where I've come from, what I've been doing. I then want to spend some time basically setting the scene for why we do prototyping. And I think I'm going to sidestep away from accessibility, away from media, and look at another example as to how the same kind of technologies that we use in all the kind of prototypes that we've been building as a team can be used across the board and where they've made a difference and those kind of things. I then want to talk a bit more about presence. So we're going to basically take apart the fact that we spent years building 360-degree video players where we put people in complete isolation and they have no real kind of concept of collaborative. They don't have other people in the same space to collaborate with. They don't have a feeling of presence that comes from knowing that you can communicate with other people. And so we're going to kind of take apart some of what we've built in the past and say why it doesn't work and maybe why actually you don't get any kind of sense of presence. And in doing this, I'm going to basically end with looking at one of the kind of current prototypes that we've been building. Hopefully, we'll get to a point where maybe we can get it running. We can actually get people having a go with it, having a play with it, seeing where it breaks. It's completely untested. It's completely something we built so that we had some kind of proof of concept before writing a grant application, basically, which means actually we got it to a really cool position, but maybe we haven't taken it any further. And it therefore means it's not tested, but it's quite a cool platform for building things going forwards and what maybe we can do going forward. And so by looking at that, I'm hoping that there's going to be justification really as to why prototyping is so important. And I think it fits very nicely in the kind of ethos of the whole kind of winter school, in that tomorrow you have time that you'll be thinking about prototyping things yourself. What kind of experiments could be done? What could we build? And so everything in my world is based around prototyping. I also always refer to myself as a hacker. You'll notice that throughout my slides, I'm not a software engineer. I'm not a good programmer. I would call myself one of those kind of jack of all trades, that I know enough about enough different technologies to plug them together. So when I start talking about writing bits of software, don't believe for 1 minute that it's well written. I'm just working in a world where I'm going to build a prototype. I'm going to show that something can be done, and then we can just hand it off to the boring software engineers who can actually build the proper version and turn it into a commercial product or whatever they want to do next. So that's kind of where I come from, and that's kind of where I sit. And so, as I say, when you see some of the prototypes we've built, I do refer to hacking them together because it's brutal. It's not efficient. It doesn't work well. The code is horrific. But we will take apart some of the code as well later on. I appreciate that the audience is very mixed as well. So we've got a split of a few people that are technology focused, people that are languages, accessibility focused, that kind of thing as well. So I like to use this kind of workshop as an opportunity to try and throw at you some ideas, give you some insights from the kind of hacking, prototyping, how the kind of computer science that throws things together might appear, and the kind of thing that goes on in our world, really. So yeah, disclaimer, I'm a technologist. I love throwing things together, building systems, bolting things together, seeing what works. I'm not a user testing expert. I'm not a software engineering expert. I don't know much about accessibility. I just fall very nicely into this world because I seem to be able to pull things together. And that is a great way to move the conversation forwards. So I was going to start with a very quick definition. So I've just pulled this off the web. It's not my definition, and I'm not sure I agree with it. And there's a lot of words in there as well. But I think it's always a nice place to start. What this workshop is going to be focused on is the idea of what virtual presence is. And I find this really interesting because this is different from immersion. Immersion is very much focused on, can we build the technology that can replicate the real world? Yes, we pretty much can, if you don't mind being able to see a few pixels and the fact you have to wear a head-mounted display, and it's a bit clunky. Presence seems to be the difference between being immersed in the environment and actually feeling like you're there. And so I like to pull out some of these definitions. I stole this from techtarget.com, who seem to have done a review recently on trying to work out the difference. And they basically were saying that virtual presence is the ability of a user to feel like they're actually there, rather than just, it looks like I'm there and I feel like I might be there. Generally using things like VR, augmented reality, or XR, as we tend to refer to the whole field as. But within this XR environment, we're referring to it as the kind of perpetual illusion of presence, which is often dependent upon the technology that makes it immersive, but it goes somewhere beyond. And I quite like the second part of their definition, where they basically say that virtual presence focuses on placing users in some kind of simulated environment. So this could be our virtual room, our virtual gallery, our virtual town, wherever we are. But doing this simultaneously with other users within the same environment to make them aware of each other's presence. And by feeling each other's presence, it boosts this whole feeling that we're actually in a community, we're actually in a real place, a kind of place. And visitors using kind of virtual presence sites are generally considered to be virtually present, and other people can see them and that kind of stuff. But we're going to pull this apart later, and hopefully make our own minds up on what we mean by some of these things. So this will be the boring 10-minute background. For those of you that already know me, I apologize now. You may have seen some of these things before. But I just wanted to tell you a little bit, if I haven't met you before, about where I come from and how I kind of fell into this world of building prototypes, particularly within the field of media accessibility. And again, I refer to everything as hacks. Don't tend to build things, I hack things. So it's a nice disclaimer that sets a level of expectation. If someone tells you something's hacked together and it doesn't work, you kind of understand. If they say you've built something and it doesn't work, there's a lot more disappointment. But I've come from kind of a world I'm a computer scientist at heart, and that's kind of my background with computer graphics as my kind of main subject area that I've been focused in. And I kind of got involved with XR and then fell into a European project quite early on based on immersive accessibility, focused on, well, we've got XR coming along. Actually, this is a new medium for video, those kind of technologies. How does that work in terms of accessibility services? And the reality is this was a number of years ago, 8 years ago or something around there. No one had mentioned the term the metaverse. Virtual reality was still kind of on the comeback. I've always loved the concept of virtual reality. I think it was about 40 years ago, Tomorrow's World started presenting the idea of this is what virtual reality is and this is how it will work. But it's taken another 20, 30 years on top of that for the display technologies to get to the point where it actually works. And so it's a concept that's been working very nicely for a number of years, and we've known how to do it, but it takes a long time for some of these bits of technology to catch up. And so we basically found ourselves in the environment of talking about, well, how do subtitles, sign language, things like that work within 360-degree video or immersive video. And although that kind of stuff was very early doors because we were interested in actually, well, where does this then map into collaborative environments and things like that? The project at the time didn't get that far. But what we did learn was that we could basically build prototypes and put them in front of users. And if you've heard me talk before, you'll probably have come across the fact that I come out with the kind of mantra that if you start with a whiteboard in this field and you ask users what they actually want, they don't have a clue. And we found that with that original project, we were basically asking, we ran a usability study, we went out requirements gathering, and we asked users what they wanted. How do you want subtitles within a 360-degree video? And as a technologist, I kind of was sat there thinking, this is going to be cool. We can put them in speech bubbles above people's heads. They can float around. We can do all sorts of interesting things. But the user requirements basically came back and said, we want 2 lines of text, 30 characters wide. It's what we've got at the moment. It works. Why would we change it? And it became very apparent very quickly that the user base that we were asking didn't really understand what we were trying to propose that they could have, because we were basically writing text descriptions on a blackboard or on a whiteboard rather than actually showing them something or giving them something to play with. And so I got involved in that first project, and then I got involved with the Immersive Captions group in the W3C, who were interested in doing how do you put subtitles within 360-degree video and things like that. And when I got involved with the W3C group, they basically had a text description of 8 different scenarios, and they were sending it out as a survey to people and saying, which one of these works best? Which is the right solution so that we can send it to the developers to build this? I ended up reading through the list, trying to work out what on earth they were talking about. It didn't even make sense. They conflicted. I couldn't work out what they were. And so this kind of was, as a technologist stepping in with a computer graphics background, the moment that I was able to kind of jump in and say, well, let's build something, see what works. And we started out, this was the first kind of prototype in this area that I built, and this was a long time ago. It was written as a web page, and because it's a web page, it makes it incredibly portable. You can basically just send a web link to someone. They can type it in, fire up the demo, and it basically gave them the option to flick through all of the options that they currently had in their 8-page document or whatever it was with text descriptions of each of them, and actually render them and see what it looks like and see how it works. And I became very popular very quickly because as someone that can hack things together, I was able to kind of build a prototype overnight, 24 hours maybe. Everyone in the W3C group were in the US, which was perfect because in Britain, you could spend the day building something and it was overnight for the US, and they would wake up the next morning and it looked like I'd done weeks worth of work. But in reality, I was just pulling together stuff that I knew how to do and was able to pull things together. But it kind of opened my eyes completely to this world of actually, you can just build stuff and try it out and get opinions on it. And it also opened my eyes that previously, I guess I'd done a lot of web development work. I knew how to build web applications. And so it became very natural to me to build this in HTML, JavaScript. And what falls out of that is the fact that you can very much just send a link to people and they can just fire it up and try it. But we learned a few things as well that I didn't necessarily realize before. Things like a web browser, JavaScript. It's amazingly powerful these days. If you want to build something quickly, JavaScript's quite a good way to go. And I'm not promoting this as the only way to build prototypes. I'm promoting this as when I got into this with 24 hours to build a prototype, I knew how to write JavaScript. So I guess it's when you only have a hammer, you see every problem as a nail, that kind of scenario. But it did work out very nicely and learned very quickly that you don't need to build native applications. You don't need fast graphics libraries, Unity, Unreal, those kind of platforms. Actually, there are JavaScript libraries that pretty much do all the stuff you need to build a prototype without any of that kind of work at all. But what was interesting was it worked, but very badly written. It was incredibly resource heavy. I mean, if you left your browser window open for more than 3 hours, I think your computer caught fire. It was that kind of world. But it was enough to move the conversation forwards in a way that we hadn't achieved by using text descriptions written on paper. And I guess those of you that I've talked in front of before and have seen some of the stuff realize that actually we managed to open the conversation and they came back and said, this is kind of interesting, but there are many other ideas we could try. Let's try it slightly differently, do different things here and there. And we basically went through several iterations over the next few months, basically looking at, well, how can you make it clear to people what's going on? Instead of just having a piece of text that can be interpreted, how can you actually show people pictorially or interactively what these kind of things look like? And we basically implemented many demos, and I was learning because at this point, I had never really built prototypes before. I guess I was a computer scientist, but I'd never suddenly had a user base of people that were saying, when are you sending out the next iteration of this? Because we all want to play it with it and look at it. And so it was really exciting as a computer scientist that had never released a piece of software or a prototype or something into the community before. But it kept kind of moving forwards and people were feeding back ideas and we were basically adding these ideas in as we went and looking at some of the things we did. And I must admit, by the time we'd built this platform, if anyone's actually interested in this platform, lots of people have seen it before, but if you haven't, I'm very happy to share a link to it. It basically parameterizes every option that we could think about in a menu. And so you can build up different scenarios to try new things. And I genuinely thought by the time we got to here, we'd nailed it because we'd basically tried every permutation of everything and found things that users liked. And I was very lucky that Larry Goldberg from Verizon Media at the time got really interested and said, Verizon Media are going to take this, it's open source, you can do what you like with it. I was quite happy for him to. But they wanted to launch some of this on their own website to show that they were trying to do captioning and make it really exciting and take it to the next level. And they sent me this lovely video of these two characters. Worst piece of film ever. Don't ever watch it. It's hideous. But they had a very limited stock of 360-degree video that they had rights that they could actually play with and we could release. And everything was just going swimmingly until they sent me this. And we realized that we were sat in a 360-degree bubble and there was someone on both sides speaking at the same time. And we realized that the platform did not support this in any way. It was a single subtitle container. It just didn't work. We had to start again. But this is one of the things I love about prototyping, because on paper, we would never have realized that we were building something that didn't work. It was only by building something, getting it to a certain level, Verizon Media suddenly getting really exciting. This was my career going off the wall, because I was about to move to the US and work for Verizon Media because I had the solution to their problems, kind of, and it didn't work. So we started again. If you're a computer scientist, you probably like the whole particle system idea, where you basically, instead of having a subtitle container, we now have some higher level stuff going on where we basically emit subtitles into the scene, give them some rules. This is how long you're allowed to live for. This is your color. This is how you're going to interact with the scene, and basically press go. So it becomes a much more kind of managed system, whereas instead of having a single subtitle, you could create as many as you wanted, wherever you wanted, and you could control them however you wanted. And again, we kind of moved through several iterations, but because we were building something and we had a prototype, and we weren't relying on Google's big teams of software developers that needed daily stand-ups to work out exactly how they were going to improve these bits of software, and it would take 3 weeks to get to the next iteration. We really were hacking things together overnight, and it really did kind of move the conversation forwards. And there was a whole load of other stuff that suddenly came in, such as actually there were no editors available that would allow us to do what we needed to do. So we hacked one together that worked for us, and that kind of stuff. And it was quite nice. There's quite a few people that use this now, because it seems to be better than some of the free tools or paid for tools that are out there. But again, it's just basically pulling things together in a web browser in order to solve the problems that we need to solve. So this led us to the fourth hack, where we realized that actually maybe we had solved a lot of these problems. We'd got them onto the web. We found a solution that works for everyone, and we could press go. We thought we'd solved it completely. And someone came up to me and basically said, well, have you done any user tests of this stuff yet? And I realized, well, that's not my world. I don't do that stuff. It's not interesting to me. I don't like people. You probably will learn that quite quickly. And so we realized that we actually need to do some testing behind some of these things as well. And this ties in quite nicely with what Chris was talking about earlier, because all of a sudden, one of the things we also realized is that most of the time people don't realize what they're doing when they're watching 360 video. If you ask them, if you give them a video to watch and say, did you read the captions? Did you see this? Which bits of the scene did you say? They don't have a clue what they actually looked at. They will tell you they did. They'll say, yes, I read every caption. But there's been some amazingly good studies where they basically used, I think it was a news broadcast, where the pictures behind the news broadcaster didn't relate to the story that the news anchor was talking about. And when asked afterwards what the theme of the news was, a lot of the people that were using the subtitles, native subtitles users, basically were referring to what the picture showed, not what the text showed. And this was really kind of interesting, because again, it was one of those moments of, you can't trust users. They don't know what they do. As much as not liking people, I know they also lie to me now. So that's not going to be a great place that we go with some of these things. So we basically, I got involved with Chris and Andrew Jakovsky and Pilar and Marta and people at this point. And we basically said, well, let's actually do some user testing on these things. And we basically ported what we had in the web, and we basically took the same application and ported it into Unity, which allowed us to exploit things like the HTC5, which has eye tracking and things involved. I find it interesting and think it's quite a nice follow-on to Chris's talk, because you probably saw him wearing a head-mounted display that had some cameras that were sat in front of the eyes, pointing very nicely at the eyes and giving you an accurate representation of where the pupils are. If you're wearing a VR headset, it suddenly becomes a lot more complicated, because you can't just put a camera in front of the eyes because there's a screen in front of the eyes. And one of the things that HTC have been focused on is they're realizing that if they're going to replicate things like emotion and things on virtual avatars in the metaverse, they need some way to tell what the eyes are actually doing. Are they open, closed? Which way are you looking, in order to map that onto your virtual character in the game or whatever. But what becomes interesting is you can actually exploit this, and you can kind of reverse engineer it back into an eye tracking system. So although the manufacturers are intending to use this to kind of gauge emotion and those kind of things, you can actually use it to tell where people are looking. And a bit like Chris was probably talking, you can get to the point where you have a gaze vector for each eye, you can calculate a convergence point. Actually, you've got a fairly good idea of working out where people were looking and what they were doing. One of the downsides is it's probably an awful lot slower than the eye tracker that Chris was using. What frequency was that running at?
120.
120. Oh, so it's the same frequency that we get off the HTC Vive, although it's not a true 120 hertz frequency, but I'm not going to go into those kind of details.
Yeah, there is.
Again, all these things, as a computer scientist, I know nothing about eye tracking. I just pick up the technology and try and work out how we hack the numbers out of it and those kind of things. But it gave us some useful things like where the gaze came from, normalized vectors and those kind of things. And we basically ported the code from JavaScript to Unity. I say I'm not a software developer, so my poor JavaScript code, I converted to C# to make it run in Unity. Probably spent a bit of time cleaning it up, making it slightly better. I probably do myself a slight disservice by saying it's awful, but we basically rewrote it so that we had a replication. And we're basically then able to do all these neat things where we could run the same videos, we could put captions in any way we liked, and we could actually read some of that data back. And Marta, in fact, was very heavily involved in some of these studies where we were basically recording eye tracking data as people were looking at the scene. This laptop's struggling a bit, actually. Interestingly, but we were able to then look at areas of interest, regions of interest. Were they looking at a person? Were they actually reading the text? And it gave us much better data than we actually got from asking the person what they thought that they'd seen and were doing themselves. So that's kind of where I came from, and I spent longer talking about that than I meant to. But I really want to make the case for kind of prototyping. So that's kind of, I think that does make a reasonably good case as to why prototypes are good, because most of this conversation only moved forwards because at each step we were building something. And this is where the kind of interdisciplinary work of technologists, computer scientists, psychologists, accessibility experts, user testers, all working together, you get to a much cooler place. But I always like this quote as well from Henry Ford. It relates very nicely to the fact that people don't know what they want. If I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses when referring to the idea of what people wanted in terms of a new motor car. And to me, this is why we prototype. User tests yield limited results from my experience, unless you can put something in front of people, a nice working product, something that almost looks like it works. Doesn't have to work, it just has to feel like it works. Paper prototypes are confusing. Let's build things. And as I say, users don't know what they want, they don't know what they do. No one likes users, particularly computer scientists don't like users. It's just one of those things in this world. A few other things we kind of learned through this pipeline as well is that if you're going to build something to ask someone's opinion of, it has to be easily sent to them or easy to distribute. If you send it to them on a CD and they have to install it and it doesn't install properly, suddenly you've lost their attention anyway. And another reason why using some of these kind of web links and that kind of stuff works. If you're going to ask someone to look at your prototype, although it can be a prototype, it kind of has to work or they're just going to lose interest straight away. Going to take a sidestep very briefly and jump into a different field just because I like prototyping things and showing things off. So this is something we've built recently, nothing to do with media accessibility, nothing to do with accessibility or media or XR. Interestingly, I've been working with some colleagues at our local hospital who have been taking very close photographs of heart cells. And by looking at the heart cells, they basically currently they use a ruler and they put it across these pictures to try and identify and classify the different cells that fix within the heart space, and they can tell whether they're cancerous or not. It takes them a very long time. It's a really bad way of doing things. And so we got kind of asked to get involved as computer science to say, well, maybe there are better ways you can do things. This would be the correct solution. I'm hands down, I'm not going to lie, we should use neural networks, convolution networks in order to do a full analysis of that image, data mining, work out what's going on underneath. This takes time. This is probably a year's development work for someone to do. And actually, they're starting from a place where they don't actually know what they're trying to achieve yet, because they're just guessing at this point. And so we jumped in really, and we said, well, let's apply this exactly the same JavaScript, HTML kind of interface that we've got now to build something that kind of works. And so we basically, again, wanted something that was easily distributable. So yeah. And just kind of worked. And so built a web page. You can send out a link. Anyone can access this. You can upload images into it. And then you can basically click on an area of interest. And the JavaScript, everything in the background is quite fast enough in order to try and identify what's going on in the background. Now, I only use this as an interesting example because quite often people are trying to use a sledgehammer to overcrack a nut or whatever the expression is. Actually, this is quite neat. You can basically, we basically in here built all the algorithms to allow you to search an image automatically, classify things as to whether they're cancerous or not, based on the rules that the NHS have provided. And it also is completely repeatable. You can kind of look at what the algorithm's doing in the background in order to try and prove and make the point as to why this whole pipeline is working. And what is interesting is that in this same project space, the whole convolution network data mining approach has also been applied. The results actually very similar to our NAF prototype. And actually, I know that there are clinicians in the health service that are currently using this web-based tool, not the data mining tool that you have to have the right hardware, you have to have all sorts of things set up. This runs on your mobile phone quite quickly. And it gives them, it's all about traffic lighting. It gives an indication of whether things work or not. So again, I'm just trying to make a case for building prototypes actually is interesting, because you can get to a place where you learn what you don't know, what you actually need to build in the full version. And actually you can get them to a point where they're pretty good and they work quite nicely. I'm quite pleased with that. That was probably a couple of afternoons work, if I'm completely honest. And it's very satisfying when you build things that people use, which is fairly new to me. So where are we? Right. Wanted to jump into presence then. What is presence when it comes to XR? And we had a definition at the beginning, a little bit, and I wanted to take this apart really. As I said, when kind of introduced what we were going to do, I mentioned the fact that the kind of industry don't really know the difference sometimes between what is immersive and what is presence. And the best kind of definition I managed to find, and the best kind of indication that I managed to find from this stuff, is that immersion is the ability to create the environment, whereas perception is actually that feeling like you're there. So yes, and what we're really aiming for when we talk about kind of XR environments is we want our users to feel present. If you're going to feel present, you need to be really engaged, feel like you're in the virtual world. But I liked kind of the definitions I was putting together because it gave me a list of a few things that you needed in order for things to feel like you're present in this environment. Things like if the actual environment or the story is compelling, you'll be absorbed by it, you'll feel like you're there. Social interaction, other avatars that you can interact with in a natural way, make it more real. And the interaction with the virtual world has to be easy, natural, so on and so forth, and that kind of stuff. So the key takeaways for me were, if we're going to adapt our kind of 360 environments to make them feel like they're present, not only do we need to make them accessible in some way, we need to offer social interaction. So suddenly we need to pull multiple people into the same environment. This is a whole kind of game changer level of what's going to come next. And those people need to be able to interact with each other. And that interaction needs to feel very natural, very easy. And so this is what we've set out to do. And this is kind of the direction that we've gone in. And so we've built a prototype for this. And I'll be very pleased to share with you where we've got to with some of this stuff as well. Everything we've done before has been based around 360-degree video, a kind of single person environment, whether it's in a web browser, whether it's in a head-mounted display, which to me ticks the box for immersive, because yes, I can stand inside this 360-degree video, look around, it probably feels like it's replicating it. But when you're there on your own watching a video, potentially doesn't feel like the presence category has been ticked. So I drew up a few requirements. I put them in quotes because obviously I'm not a requirements gathering person. This is just what the kind of wish list that I think we need to do in order to make this work. At the core of this, we suddenly need an XR environment. We kind of had that before with the 360 video player. We had an XR environment implemented with 3.js, that 3 graphics library written in JavaScript. And all we were doing before was basically putting a sphere in the middle of it and projecting a video onto it. So let's get rid of the video and make a room that we can walk around instead. We need social interaction. So suddenly we're no longer going to work on our own, on our browser, on our computer that's not talking to anything else in the world. It's just previously been an isolated piece of software running. Now we're going to have to do something interesting to get data in and out and understand where people are and all those kind of things. Going to have to build some interaction. There's a lot of cues we can steal from kind of in the post-pandemic world. Everyone's very used to using video conferencing, and actually having video, audio from a person is a great way to make that kind of two-way communication work. But if we're going to pull it into our XR environment, we need to map that into the environment in some way, keep the interface simple, and then focus quite heavily on the accessibility. It has to work for people that can't hear or see, or somewhere in between that we need to make these things work for. And we focus quite heavily on captioning, although the prototype, we did run a demo with it where we had an additional user that was coming in to do the sign language as well. So although things like captions are very easy to generate automatically, sign language is still quite in its infancy. I can't even talk today. And so we talked a bit about how that might work. I'm a computer scientist. We like architecture. This is what we built, and I'll show you in a minute what it looked like. So we basically started with a web page. I'm not going to make any justification for that other than it's very easy to share the link, and I know how to build web stuff. It's a hammer. This problem was a nail. Let's stick with it. Underneath that, we pulled in 3 APIs that exist, free to use. 3.js, it's this lovely graphics library. It pretty much does everything that Unity might do, kind of, but within a web browser context. So it gives us the kind of graphics tools that we need. And there were 2 other APIs that were quite important to us at this point. We had the web speech API, which is brilliant for voice recognition, those kind of things. And I'll show you in a minute how we exploited it in order to make it recognize voices, generate captions and things like that automatically. And something that was new to me was media capture and streams API. I wanted to be able to kind of replicate online video conferencing, but within XR. Trust me, it sounds a bit wacky, but it kind of worked, and we kind of got to a good place with it. But my real issue with making this work is suddenly we're going from a web browser context to a multi-user environment where we need some kind of tools to keep everything in sync. If you've got 10 people walking around an XR environment, everyone needs to know where everyone else is. If you want to map a voice into that space, suddenly all the networking infrastructure behind it has to work appropriately to transport video, audio, those kind of things around. And we ended up basically using 2 different approaches to networking. We used something called a Node.js server. It's basically a web server technology written in JavaScript. You can basically run JavaScript scripts on a server, and it handles communications for us. The real problem there is if you have a single point, a server, in the case of the demo we've got running at the moment, it's running back in the UK. If everyone's trying to then pull in webcam feeds and audio and things like that, it becomes really inefficient to bounce those all off the server that sat on my desk in Salford and return them to all the other users. So we also pulled in another technology called WebRTC, which is a real-time communication protocol, which basically allows us to do two things. So we basically use a web server running Node.js to kind of broker communications. It knows who everyone is, where they are, but we then also fire off a separate kind of networking protocol that says, once we know where everyone is, what their IP addresses are, when we start grabbing things like audio and video from users, we use WebRTC, which creates direct connections between all the users. So it gets very messy and complicated. And in terms of building rapid prototypes, all of a sudden, this was quite complicated. But we were kind of determined to make it work. How am I doing for time? So yeah, this is kind of what it looked like. Again, we had a server. The server that we're using for the demo that I've got running at the moment is in the UK, in Salford, sat on my desk. It's a Raspberry Pi, if anyone's particularly interested. And what we have is we have an arbitrary number of users which can connect to the server. They can say, I'm a new user, I want to connect to this space. It then tells all the other machines, all the other users that are connected, there's a new person, this is where they are, this is what their current actions are. And it also then says, do you have audio and video capabilities? If so, we're going to ping off a web real-time communication stream between them. One of the things that I found particularly interesting by this architecture is wanted to build an environment where people could work together on a kind of educational experience or have some kind of simulation that is applied to everyone in the same space. So because the environment itself is kind of managed remotely by this machine sat on my desk in Salford, what we can do is we can basically use that to contain all the environment data that says what's actually happening around everyone. And we can run all sorts of different simulations, but provided the simulations interact back to the server, it then pushes them out to all the users as it happens. So you can kind of imagine that if we had some kind of video playing or whatever, it would allow the server to keep everything in sync within reality. So we built this kind of virtual room. I simulated it at the time. So Carlos at the time was someone that I'd been speaking to on Teams, so may have ended up as one of the characters that appeared within the first kind of prototypes. I think Marta and Krish are both in there as well. So I apologize for having stolen your image off a Teams call at some point because I was simulating streams at the time. But we basically built this room. It's 3.js. I put a stage at one end, why wouldn't you? And a couple of pictures on the wall. At one point, I think it was my kids' artwork that featured on the wall. And at other times, we had Chris Patnow's portrait in the wall as he was very annoyed by it, for anyone that knows who he is. But the idea was this environment would allow us to create a very crude kind of avatar, but we could then take the video feed from that user's camera and kind of map it into a picture in front of the person. So we're not saying this is the right way to do anything. This was just kind of, sounds like a good place to start, see what happens. We also then put things like virtual kind of screens and things in there. Because of the 3D environment and the fact that we had all this WebRTC stuff going on in the background, you could, for example, take a signer and get them to fire up a slightly different version of the software on their laptop. And it would basically let them take their camera feed and map it into the environment as well. And everyone would see that as well as hearing the audio, so they could do the sign language. Also added things. So we wanted to add captioning and kind of automatic captioning. So it seemed quite sensible to have a billboard that kind of appeared above people's heads with an arbitrary number of lines so that you can have captions that move up and down. And we were basically just exploring. So the first iteration allowed you to type what was going to be shown on your kind of captions. And then we went from there to the web speech API that used speech recognition as well to write those captions for you. So again, this, not saying for 1 minute any of this is the right way to do things, except it seemed like quite a good, sensible place to start from. And again, I think this is a horrible video of me from one of the early tests, where you can kind of see that I was sat in my office, but I can control this character to walk around the room. And at this point, I can also put videos where I like and that kind of thing. We built the kind of framework to put all these things together. But this was using web media to actually take speech recognition to then convert that into captions, put that on the avatar, and anyone in the same space could kind of see that. And we were basically just playing because, like I say, we basically wanted a very low-level prototype that this kind of environment could exist, because we were trying to, at the time, argue as part of a grant proposal that we already had some technology in this space, so we built something. And that's where we were. One of my favorite snapshots from this early kind of prototyping as well on the next slide, I will just give the background to it first, because we were just building stuff and we weren't thinking about what we were doing. It became logical to me that the first thing, if you wanted to be able to communicate and microphones or whatever didn't work, is that you should just be able to type on the keyboard what you wanted to appear and it would pop up. And it seemed very logical to me to write this environment with a keyboard interaction on the letter T. So if you want to type something, you press T first, the keyboard stops using the letters to let you move around and lets you type things in. Hadn't occurred to me that you then can't type everything if you haven't got the T. But Pilar, as some of you will know, was one of the first people that I kind of threw the link at and said, just jump in here and see what you think. And why she called herself Super Pilly, I don't know, but she'd probably be very embarrassed if I was sharing these pictures. But it was very interesting that she was able to identify very quickly that actually pressing T toggled the talk mode on and off, and so no longer appeared in the text you could type in, and so ended up typing that completely at me, which kind of makes sense when you realize that T doesn't work. And yeah, I removed the fact that you could no longer use the T and use the hash character to turn it on or off. It was interesting though as well, because I kind of threw this link at Pilar. I think well, a lot of you know Pilar, and said, jump in here. And we spent the next 45 minutes having a meeting, chatting within this space completely naturally, without really realizing that we were playing with something that didn't really work. And so that kind of gave hope to the fact that she obviously had a lot of kind of presence within this environment and kind of believed that it worked and what it was doing. And so I thought that was quite an interesting little example. So I have 10 minutes, I think. What we'll do is I'll fire it up and we'll see if it works. I warn you, the chances of any of it working are very slim. So I like to set the bar low before we jump into any of these things. Let's get rid of that. So the first thing is we need a terminal. So I like to give people a bit of an insight into how some of these things work. This is just the terminal on my laptop. I'm going to use SSH to connect to the server that's on my desk in Salford. And if the network works, we'll get in. If I remember my password, we'll get in, which is even better. So this is actually a Raspberry Pi sat on my desk, you know, one of those little embedded computers. It's not a high performance computer, anything like that. But I'm connected into there, and I can jump into the directory where the files are. And this is my node.js application. It has a number of files. If anyone's particularly interested in node.js and that kind of stuff, I'm very happy to dive into some of the code and things that's behind it. But in essence, it's a very straightforward kind of scripting language where you basically write JavaScript to define how things work. And I appreciate the text is really small and that we probably don't want to jump too much into some of the things that are in here. But you basically do some interesting things, like you tell it what you're using, you set up some routing basically you're defining how a web server is going to work and what pages get served when people type in / on the URL. And we had to do some other things like we had to make sure that we had SSL certificates. I learned quite quickly in this as well, if you want to capture someone's video feed and send it somewhere else, you can't do it on an unsecured internet connection. I had no idea of this and spent a long time wondering why what worked on my local computer didn't work outside. But if you want to send web video, you have to use HTTPS. It has to be a secure connection to allow you to do it. And there's nothing particularly complicated or interesting in there, except my mouse won't scroll, except it sets up a load of kind of routing and rules, and it does things like it manages a list of clients. So there's basically a data structure in there that says when someone's connected or disconnected, let's keep a record of it so that when we have groups of other people, we can send that kind of stuff out. But I won't bore you too much with the details, other than you get to the end and you create a server and you tell it to listen on port 3000. And so that's what we shall do. So in order to fire up a node application, we just run node and give it the index file. And hopefully our server starts running. And then I will show you what happens if we jump into the room. And then after I've done this, if anyone else wants to try it as well, we'll see how many people can get in before it falls over, probably. But let me show you what happens first. So when visiting this page, we're presented with a very simple kind of 3.js application with other layers on the top that's using the web media API to grab my video feed from here. And it's currently mapping it onto the sign language person on the back wall of that space and those kind of things. So I can enter this room, I can walk around, and it's nothing particularly exciting. There's a couple of pictures on the wall, 2 of our dogs that seem to be involved in most of the things that I do, tend to feature on a lot of them. A piece of artwork that I bought a while ago and just have sat around. And we also then built kind of interaction points and things that sit in here as well. So if you go over to the light switch in the corner, you can, for example, turn the lights off. Might seem a very trivial thing, but actually to turn the lights off, what we're doing is we're instructing the server to turn the lights off, and the server is then telling anyone in the room's web browser to turn the lights off so that everyone's in sync. So again, it's all very crude and it feels quite simple, but to get it to work was slightly more than I'd previously come across with these kind of prototypes. And of course, it's not right if you haven't got disco mode in the room, you can turn those kind of things on and off as well. But the idea was to build an environment that the server could, it's not going to let me turn it off. Look at that. Oh, you have to turn that off. So you can also do things like, you can interact with anything in the scene, like you can put slides onto one of the virtual screens and this kind of thing. Because I was interested in the whole, how do you interact with this space if you need subtitles, if you can't hear audio? So one of the interesting things that's also going on is it's also taking my audio and it also maps that into the space within you. It basically uses a logarithmic algorithm to fade the audio out as you walk away from people. So if you're stood next to someone, you get the audio that's coming through from them. If you're on the other side of the room, you don't. But you notice in the top corner, it shows you a kind of representation of the bars that are currently sat on top of my head. And so if I press T to go into that lovely mode, I can actually type things in, and it would currently be putting a subtitle above my head. And that's kind of the way things work. Also, just to try one of the experiments we built on top of it, and to show that demos always go wrong when you do them live, you can also put it into voice recognition, and it will take everything I say and turn that into captions in real time. So you can kind of see that there's a lot of kind of experiments that we bolted on top, and miraculously, Google's speech to text was working quite nicely to turn what I was saying into those kind of lines of text. And it's still going, which is slightly annoying, and it shows you that this is very prototypey kind of stuff. So I have about 3 minutes before the end of my slot. Anyone got their laptop open and got Chrome and want to jump in as well?
For this?
Or Firefox or Safari probably will work. I'd love to say I haven't tested it in anything.
No.
Pardon?
No.
It doesn't matter. If someone wants to,
Chrome is not working.
what's not working?
Page isn't working.
What network are you on? Try HTTPS before it.
Okay.
Chris can. Let's see if see what happens when one person jumps in before everyone jumps in.
One idea. Enhance the presence.
I'm just going to mute that because I can hear you now.
To enhance the presence.
Yep.
Maybe your server could connect to when you turn on the disco mode. So your server maybe can connect to the server of this university and turn on the disco mode here in the room.
That would be genius. Okay, so Carlos is in. Might be worth muting things in the room actually, because all of a sudden there's going to be audio feeds going all over the place. If your laptop won't allow the video to be captured, it doesn't bring a video feed in. But it's kind of interesting to see that a few people have made it in and someone's found disco mode. Hands up. So it's interesting that it's kind of working for some people. Some people it's maybe not, but it's browser dependent slightly and it's untested. And it's a small miracle that hasn't fallen over straight away with that kind of stuff. So that's really where we're up to. And that's really kind of, we built this platform not knowing where we're going or what we're doing with it. Other than actually, it does seem to work relatively well for having conversations and those kind of things in.
Can I shoot?
You can, but it's disabled. Not that as a computer scientist, that was the first thing I built in. So it's nice to see Krish's little face in the. So yeah,
How to turn around?
use the mouse
Oh, use the mouse.
and WASD to walk around.
Works.
So this is our kind of latest prototype, and it's something that we can expand, and I'm happy to have any kind of conversations about taking it forwards and what else we can do with it. As I kind of say, we kind of reached a point with this that we haven't done anything since. But it's really interesting to see people play with it and it kind of working. So that's kind of interesting. Krish, I have a remote control that can override it. So that's pretty much all I want to say, really. Any questions or comments or interest or? Absolutely. But as I say, you can kind of see that if your laptop and your browser has enabled video, there's nothing there to check to make sure it has. So if it doesn't, again, it's early prototype, but you can see that some people have appeared with their faces, and if we weren't all in the same room, you'd also be able to hear the audio that's going through and those kind of things as well. So we think it's an interesting platform to start with. And that's all I have to say, really. So I welcome any questions, comments, or I've just lost everyone that's trying to work out what button fires. Depressingly, part of the model was built on a shooting game, so that's why it is actually in there. It's kind of interesting. Hasn't fallen over yet. And as I say, it's a little Raspberry Pi running it all in Salford. So. Yeah, I had a bit of fun. It's an image I stole from Google Images. And then I mapped in some spheres to turn into lights, but it was just because I needed some simulation. I have a feeling I've lost the whole room now. I reckon I could have a nap now and it'll be fine. But yeah, there we are. I'm going to stop talking now. I'll leave it running.
You can start with this.
Pardon? If I'd started with this, I'd have lost the audience an hour ago. Although what is interesting is the fact that people are finding it interesting to play with. You see, I thought this would kill 30 seconds, but so we are. I'm going to turn it off. Super user. It's doing quite well. It's got that many users in there at the moment. But
how do you know it's a good person?
Because when you joined,
yeah,
you've joined as a real person. What you can do is I have all sorts of scripts like I have all sorts of scripts that generate bots that go in and run around and give talks and things. Because then it will appear as not a real person. And interestingly, should be now on stage presenting my photo collection. But I don't know where the bot is. Oh, there he is. You see, when you're a computer scientist and you don't like people, you have to make your own friends. So I had to create this that just walked around saying hello world and occasionally changes the photos on the wall. Again, it was kind of all about being able to script events that happen for everyone. But anyway, there we are. I'm over time.